A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I'd now like to recognize myself for an opening statement. And this is a joint subcommittee hearing between Asia Pacific and the Western Hemisphere subcommittees, and so we will allow opening statements from both chairmen as well as ranking members. In 1793, President George Washington warned a young America that a reputation of weakness could lead us to a loss of America's rank among nations, and that if we desire to secure peace, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. Washington also believed a uniform and well-digested plan was vital to meeting these objectives. While the need for strategic planning to pursue a position of strength and keep the peace finds relevance today, the United States seems to have forgotten Washington's counsel. Broken promises, faded red lines, budget constraints, a lack of support for traditional allies, and an increasing reliance on tactics rather than strategy have communicated U.S. weakness to a watching world. In 2013, Secretary John Kerry affirmed that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over, effectively putting our other countries, such as China, on notice that the United States would no longer contend their actions in our neighborhood, the Western Hemisphere. In contrast to Roosevelt's policy of the good neighbor in 1933, the U.S. has drifted instead toward benign neglect toward the very countries that have the greatest potential to impact the daily lives of American people, those in Latin America and the Caribbean. China has taken notice, and China has stepped up into this vacuum of leadership. Today, China is weaving an intricate web of alliances in the Western Hemisphere through a vast array of diplomatic, economic, and military ties with multiple countries in the region. Although the United States remains the largest trading partner for Latin America, and I want to emphasize this, China is now the region's second largest trading partner and has free trade agreements with Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica. This year, China hosted the first ever China CELAC Summit in Beijing for Latin American and Caribbean nations. This organization expressly excludes both Canada and the United States. Since 2005, China has provided over $100 billion in credit to the region. Last year, China announced it would give nearly $35 billion in loans to the region in coming years, and this year China promised its investment in the region would hit $250 billion over the next 10 years. These are not just empty assurances. According to the Inter-American Dialogue, China has provided 16 loans valued at over $56 billion to Venezuela, 10 loans valued at $22 billion to Brazil, 10 loans valued at $19 billion to Argentina, and 12 loans valued at almost $11 billion to Ecuador. In particular, Chinese banks have effectively provided a lifeline to these governments whose economic mismanagement and corruption prevent them from accessing Western institutions. In return, China receives oil, in the case of both Venezuela and Ecuador. In addition, China has been buying up land and companies in the region, investing heavily in infrastructure and ports, as well as gobbling up a lot of rare earth minerals. From 2008 to 2012, the 10 largest Chinese mergers and acquisitions occurred in Brazil and Argentina, and other deals have occurred in Ecuador, Venezuela, and Peru. Of significant interest are two specific infrastructure projects. First, a proposed Chinese-funded and Chinese-controlled Nicaragua Canal, estimated to cost nearly $7 billion, which would rival the Panama Canal and provide greater access for Chinese ships and potentially submarines to the waters near U.S. shores. Second, a Chinese-funded Twin Ocean Railroad project connecting Peru and Brazil would also project greater Chinese influence and presence in Latin America. On a more troubling front, Brazil has provided the Chinese with access to its satellite tracking facilities, which could allow China to gain a more comprehensive picture of the flight paths of U.S. satellites. In addition, Chinese security ties to the region continue to deepen with the Chinese arms sales to Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Argentina. Reportedly, China has even expanded its arms sales beyond traditional nation-states through providing military-caliber weapons to non-state actors such as the FARC terrorist organization in Colombia and drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. This activity has only served to increase the number of weapons in the hands of paramilitary forces and transnational criminal networks. It should be of grave concern to all Americans that the Chinese maintain a military presence in Cuba, specifically Lourdes, Bejucal, and Santiago de Cuba, all of which were former Soviet-era monitoring facilities. Clearly, China has big plans right here in our own hemisphere, and what are we doing about it? Traditional thinking about China's engagement in the Western Hemisphere was that it was largely being done to counter diplomatic efforts in Taiwan and the region, or as a way of paying for extractives or buying energy commodities to fuel their ever-expanding economy. Some have complained that China uses the region as a dumping ground for goods such as steel, textiles, footwear, consumer electronics, and tires, and a visit to the marketplaces of the Caribbean and South America would seem to confirm some of those suspicions. Chinese companies operating in the region often bring their own workers, which they have no real effect on economic growth or jobs in places where they operate, creating a source of friction between China and the countries in the region. So in conclusion, the U.S. cannot continue to simply ignore China's presence in this hemisphere. The U.S. must engage more deeply in a sustained way with countries in the Western Hemisphere. It should serve as a jarring wake-up call that just a few days ago, 5 Chinese Navy ships were spotted off the coast of Alaska. This hearing will be a comprehensive overview of China's activities in the Western Hemisphere and consider how the U.S. can better balance those actions with more effective engagement in the region. So I look forward to hearing from today's expert witnesses. And with that, I'll turn to the ranking member, Mr. Sears from New Jersey, for any opening statement he may have, and then I'll come to the gentleman from Arizona. So, Mr. Sears, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today, we are examining China's continued effort to assert influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over the past decade, China's engagement with Latin America has grown significantly, both economically and diplomatically. Chinese leaders have made several trips throughout the region, including Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, and Cuba. Their engagements comes by the way of foreign direct investment, loans, and increased economic ties. Specifically, they have pledged $250 billion in investment in the region over the next 10 years. China's interest in the region is a result of their constant search for new markets to procure natural resources such as oil, various oils and minerals, and agricultural products to feed their domestic needs. Over the past 12 years, trade between Latin America and China has grown from $17 billion to $262 billion. By many estimates, China is the third largest source of foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. While this can mean greater investment for an emerging Latin American economies and a boost in trade with the region, there are also pitfalls. Chinese investments come with the baggage of dubious fundings, environmental disregard, and poor labor and health conditions for workers. Proposed agreements like the $50 billion 172-mile canal in Nicaragua risk displacing indigenous communities, destroying ecological preserves, and isn't guaranteed to be completed. Mines and timber fields run by Chinese companies have reported dangerous working conditions where laborers are overworked, mistreated, and constantly operating in unsafe environments. Too many years of the United States has focused on other parts of the world, which has led to neglect our own neighborhood. While many have viewed China's increased engagement in the region as a positive contributor to the region's economic growth, we must remain vigilant of what the long-term consequences might be and reaffirm our own commitment to the region. If China wants to continue to engage our neighbors, we must insist that they comply with international labor, health, and environmental standards. I look forward to hearing from our panelists, and thank you.
Mr. Salmon, the former chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee in the last Congress, now chairman of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee, he is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm a lot of former things, and I'm not going to admit to them all today. But I'd like to thank my good friend, Chairman Duncan, for convening this joint hearing with me today on China's presence and influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, what I believe to be an understudied yet strategically important trend. I'm glad we have a distinguished panel here today to help shed light on this very important issue. We're here today to examine the extent of Chinese political, economic, and military influence in the region, as well as how that may affect U.S. strategic interests. China's bilateral trade with this hemisphere grew from $15 billion in 2001 to $288.9 billion in 2013. These numbers are staggering and indicative of China's dedication to bolstering its presence in the region. This January, China pledged to invest $250 billion in Latin America over the next 10 years, serving China's strategic interests of securing access to energy, agriculture, and consumer markets, and serving developing Latin American countries' needs for infrastructure development and technological innovation. While China's presence in Latin America and the Caribbean has been largely limited to trade and investment, there is a movement towards greater military relationships. Nuclear cooperation, shared space assets, and arms sales not only provide China with economic and military leverage in the region, but also may expand China's ability to mitigate one of our major advantages, our relative geographic isolation. China will continue to allege that it has no foreign bases, meaning that their military posture is inherently defensive. But China's non-explicitly military partnerships with countries in strategic geographic locations like Brazil to share space and satellite assets for Earth observation may raise some eyebrows. No foreign bases do not mean no foreign presence, and we should be wary of any potential military implications of Chinese presence in our neighborhood. In lending billions of dollars to service legitimate needs in developing countries in the Western Hemisphere, China has secured not only lucrative contracts, but also diplomatic support. In the 70s and the 80s, China made similar inroads in economic assistance to Africa, propelled by the mutual benefit of resources for China and development of African nations. Today, Chinese infrastructure has expanded throughout the continent, and its presence there dominates. China's involvement in Africa has also marked many African nations turn away from formally recognizing Taiwan. In the Western Hemisphere, we currently have 12 states out of 22 total that have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, including Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Haiti. Consider China's political benefits from stronger relations with Latin America and the Caribbean countries and what that would mean for the recognition of Taiwan. I'm wary of whether China leverages its economic and political sway to further isolate Taiwan. China's growing economic, trade, military, and diplomatic relationships with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean certainly have implications for U.S. foreign engagement in the region. We welcome China's presence in the region and hope that they will yield mutual benefit for all countries involved. However, we hope this does not come at the expense of the rule of law and good governance and further entrenching inequality, corruption, illicit commerce, and violence. As the United States continues to look eastward toward Asia, a vital part of our strategic economic future, we must not forget the relationship with our closest neighbors. I look forward to the hearing today about China's strategy within the Western Hemisphere and how we can more effectively manage our presence and our strategy and balance our relationship with our region, our neighbors in the region, and China. Thanks a lot, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon, for your great leadership and work on these issues in both hemispheres, and they're so important to the American people, so I appreciate that. And before I recognize you, the bio for each of the witnesses is provided beforehand. I'm not going to read that. You have a lighting system in front of you. We're going to try to maintain a 5-minute rule, if you will. When it gets to yellow, just start trying to wrap up. When it gets to red, we're going to allow a little leeway, but we're going to move on. So I will go ahead and recognize Dr. Ellis first for 5 minutes, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Chairman Duncan, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Cyrus, distinguished committee members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my analysis with you today. I will summarize my written remarks for the committee. Chinese engagement with Latin America, while producing some benefits for some actors in the region, is generating negative consequences, and not only for the region, but also for the strategic position of the United States. Moreover, these consequences are evolving but not abating with China's current economic deceleration. PRC trade with the hemisphere today is 20 times greater than it was in 2001, with China primarily purchasing low value-added commodities while selling higher value-added manufactured products and services. China has also loaned more than $119 billion to the region since 2005, with approximately 3/4 going to Argentina and the regimes of Alba. The physical presence of Chinese companies in the region has taken off in the last 5 years, particularly in mining and petroleum, construction, manufacturing, telecommunications, logistics, and banking. This presence has given China a greater stake in the internal affairs of the countries in which they operate. With Taiwan, the PRC has generally honored its 2008 informal agreement not to woo countries recognizing the others to change their diplomatic position. Yet, leaders of countries recognizing Taiwan has regularly expressed interest in establishing relations with the PRC. Thus, if current Taiwan ROC rapprochement breaks down, I believe that the PRC could rapidly eliminate the remaining basis of ROC diplomatic legitimacy in the Hemisphere. I see the near-term objectives of the PRC in the Hemisphere as principally economic, yet no less impactful for the U.S. and the region: primary products, foodstuffs, markets, and technology. China's President Xi has clearly engaged the Hemisphere more boldly than his predecessors, including important trips in May 2013 and July 2014. The later included the first China-CELAC summit, and indeed, as Chairman Duncan pointed out, an important Chinese choice to frame its multilateral engagement with the Hemisphere around an institution that excludes the United States and Canada. The current deceleration of the Chinese economy is likely to decrease PRC commodity investments and the value of commodity imports, but will also likely expand Chinese efforts to sell its goods and services to the region and to pursue more loan-backed infrastructure projects, increasing tensions in an already troubled relationship. I am concerned that the PRC engagement is indirectly undermining democracy and good governance in the region, as loans to populist regimes weaken the accountability of their leaders to citizens and institutions and facilitate corruption. In addition, PRC military activities in the Western Hemisphere, as acknowledged, are significant and growing. Chinese defense conglomerates such as Norinco are selling increasingly capable military goods to an ever broader array of clients. In addition to the well-known sales to Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, the Peruvian Army just last month received 27 Chinese artillery vehicles, while Argentina plans to purchase Chinese ocean patrol vessels and armored personnel carriers, among other items. Chinese military personnel attend courses in Colombia's Tolamaida military base and at Brazil's Jungle Warfare School in Manaus. The PLA has progressed from participation in multilateral forces such as MINUSTA in Haiti to bilateral engagements, including a November 2010 medical exercise with Peru and the December 2011 deployment of its hospital ship Peace Ark to the Caribbean. In October 2013, for the first time, Chinese warships conducted combat exercises in the region, including engagements with Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. My recommendations to the committee respectfully include: number one, working with our regional partners to strengthen their government institutions for engaging with our PRC so that all get a fair and constructive deal. Two, ratifying an effective trans-Pacific partnership open to China in the future is one step in constructing a multilateral, rule-of-law-based regime across the Pacific. Three, facilitating ties between the Western Hemisphere and Asian partners who share our values, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India. Four, expanding theater security cooperation to bolster the U.S. position as partner of choice in the region. Five, prioritizing a functional inter-American system in which the OAS, and not CELAC or UNASUR, is the multilateral vehicle to engage China and resolve regional security issues. Six, articulating a clearer vision of what the U.S. stands for in the Hemisphere and why the U.S. approach best advances broad-based development, prosperity, and human dignity. Respectfully, the U.S. cannot and should not block China-Latin American engagement, but we must, I feel, work to ensure that it is consistent with our own security while advancing the well-being of those with whom we share this hemisphere. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Having a conversation, is it Dussel Peters or just Peters? Dussel Peters? Dr. Dussel Peters recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittees. I would like to share with you the work of the last 15 years we've been doing on the Mexico and Latin America-China relationship, and I also invite you to participate next Wednesday in a presentation of a report we will do with the Atlantic Council exactly on this topic. No? I would like to share with you 3 topics. First, the first issue, the increasing relationship of Latin America and China in all the topics that we've been mentioning is no coincidence, which means China has been, in the last at least 10 years, releasing a group of white papers regarding this relationship. I would invite you to go through the cooperation plan of CELAC and China, the first ministerial meeting that was published in January of 2015, which establishes very clear goals regarding trade, investment, infrastructure projects, and funding, respectively. There is no single Latin American country that so far has established a short, medium, and long-term strategy vis-à-vis China. This results in a substantial disadvantage for Latin America. Second, as you mentioned, China has become the second largest trading partner of Latin America. Latin America has a huge trade deficit, and particularly relevant is the difference in the group of topics and of products that the region is exporting to China. Less than 5% of Latin American exports to China are of medium and high technological level. There is a huge gap with what China is exporting to the region, and this has also reflected and explains the region's increasing disenchantment with its most dynamic partner. Finally, the third topic I would like to share with you is that while it is well known that China has participated importantly in the NAFTA region and displaced also Mexican exports to the United States, probably the United States has been the main loser in this new triangular relationship between the United States, Latin America, and China. In the paper I submitted to you, we calculate that 72% of the United States exports to Latin America are threatened by Chinese exports. And probably much more important is that if we assume the share of the United States in Latin American imports of 2001, when China became a member of the World Trade Organization, if we assume the same share of Latin American imports in 2014, the United States would have exported to Latin America more than 145 billions additionally. If we take this 145 billions in 2014, according to the Department of Commerce, this 145 billion account for 840,000 jobs that the United States would have gained maintaining the same share than 2001. Again, this is a substantial and critical topic, not only for Latin America and for Mexico, but for the United States. I finish with two recommendations. First, I invite very much both subcommittees and the House of Representatives, to support, fund, and create academic and private institutions in the United States to promote detailed understanding of a dialogue on the global reemergence of China, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, since it also affects U.S. trade, production, and employment, especially in manufacturing and particularly in the automobile and auto parts sectors. Secondly, I invite you to actively participate in and support the important work that has been done in Latin America and the Caribbean on the many issues related to this new triangular relationship. Institutions such as CELAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Inter-American Development Bank are some of the institutions where you could participate. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and the chair will now recognize Ms. Joseph Harris. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and a very good evening to you, Chairman Duncan, Chairman Salmon, and Member Ceres. My contribution comes at a very...
You could pull that microphone down just a little bit. There you go.
Is this better?
There you go.
Thank you very much. My contribution comes at a very fortuitous time. It is the culmination of a 4-year inquisition that have just concluded in relation to the formidable strategic progress that China has been making in both hemispheres, so that the statement on hand will therefore be confined to the following. I shall describe China's engagement with the Caribbean, why Caribbean countries are interested in Beijing, its objectives in the Caribbean and success to date, a description of the economic relations, and recommendations to the Honorable Congress. China is now the third largest investor in the Caribbean, with the United States and the European Union occupying the two top spots. Its share of foreign investment regionally is an estimated 9% with trade volume of US, which is $156 billion. Given this fairly modest quantum, in order to make sense of the region's magnetism to Beijing, we need to take stock of its strategic and ideological significance, bearing in mind that the Caribbean is part of the wider inter-American landscape, the history and character of which is uniquely circumscribed by legal and political instruments, in principle and practice, that has helped to shape this environment. The PRC is, in contrast, unconversant with these aphorisms, if only for this reason, their engagements would have serious repercussions, potentially so, that can very well challenge the political culture and democratic traditions and values of our hemisphere. In order to understand Beijing's ambitions, we need to keyhole its interests, and these are essentially as follows, in 11 short points. Sourcing and consolidating cheap supplies of food to sustain its burgeoning population. Gaining comparative advantage along key trading routes. The Caribbean, as already alluded, takes form of the port development projects, and it forms part of key choke points that are vital to Western Hemisphere trade and defense concerns. Gaining access to raw materials and vital resources in anticipation of the looming problem of a worldwide resource scarcity in fuels, metals, and minerals. Infiltrating fuel markets through asset acquisition, as demonstrated in parts of the mainland like Colombia and Venezuela. Securing access to reserves of natural gas, which positions Trinidad and Tobago as an ideal strategic partner. Accessing and utilizing large areas of fertile land in promising locations, such as mainland Guyana, Suriname, and Belize. Diversifying and consolidating its commercial portfolio to attain competitive advantage and market supremacy. Introducing more enticing economic structures for countries to adopt, and this avenue provides a counterweight to the classical neoliberal model. Gaining a foothold on the US market indirectly through frontline jurisdictions such as Bahamas and Jamaica, and opening employment opportunities abroad for its tens of thousands of nationals that have been migrating to the urban areas in China in search of jobs. I shall now get into the main areas in which the Caribbean has been more or less lured towards engaging with Beijing. These are the constraints that governments in the Caribbean have been constructed with, which causes them to look to Beijing and partner with it. Inflexible fiscal policies, low gross domestic product growth rates, high levels of violent crime and illicit traffic, the inability of our governments to attract development assistance, the increased liberalization of global trade, which has diminished market access, the small size of countries which depletes from the full benefits of economies of scale, and the failure of intra-regional single market arrangements, as well as the increasing costs of energy in the face of fluctuating prices. Chairman, what I would recommend is that the US and the Caribbean consolidate our deepening strategic relationships, which began in 2010 under the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. This would essentially mean strengthening the regional security architecture through continued engagement with the United States, similar that has been done under the CBSI initiative, through more deepened security arrangements with our military, with our security and intelligence agencies, as well as interoperability and asset sharing. As a result of constraints of time, I would invite you, Chairman, and the rest of the listeners to refer to my most recently published inquisition, which provides compelling support in terms of statistical detail on those areas in which Beijing has been making inroads into the hemisphere. The study is called The Twilight of America's Omnipresence, and it gives an in-depth analysis of the military inroads, economic inroads, political inroads being made by Beijing, and makes suggestions as how the United States could strengthen and build its relationship with the Caribbean in order to rebalance itself within the hemisphere. Thank you, Chairman, for your time.
I want to thank you. And now Ms. Myers is recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. I would like to thank the committee and subcommittee chairman and ranking members and other esteemed committee members for the opportunity to be here today. I'll be summarizing my written testimony, which I've submitted for the record. Let me begin by saying that this hearing, China's Advance in Latin America and the Caribbean, is very appropriately titled. As we've discussed, China's presence in Latin America and other regions has grown at a remarkable rate in just over a decade. Latin American and Caribbean exports to China have increased 23% per year on average since 2000, although that has slowed rather considerably in recent years. We've talked a lot about the $119 billion in finance that China has given to Latin America since 2005, and most of that is going to Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil. There are numerous investors now present in Latin America, small private ones, large SOEs, banks, both commercial and policy banks, and also China's sovereign wealth fund, although China's foreign direct investment in the region is still fairly low. China's growing presence, as we've mentioned, in Latin America is also apparent in cultural, educational, military, and political spheres. Although over the past decade and a half, so much of overall engagement has supported the objectives of China's so-called going out strategy. And these include securing access to raw materials, establishing new markets for Chinese exports, promoting Chinese brands, and there are many, many Chinese brands in Latin America now, and internationalizing Chinese firms. And much of what we see China doing in the region today can still be viewed as supporting these objectives. In this sense, China's interests in the region have been rather static. But the relationship has also evolved in some very important ways. And I'd like to use my remaining time to briefly highlight 3 examples. We've first of all seen some important changes in the way in which Chinese firms are investing in the region. Especially in the agriculture and energy sectors, there are growing efforts to invest not only in crop cultivation and mining and drilling, for example, but across entire supply chains in production, processing, logistics, and marketing. This in order to better control supply and pricing and also to compete with other multinationals and also US firms. Like in Asia, Latin America has also seen growing interest from China in the development of cross-regional transportation infrastructure, such as the proposed Brazil-Peru Railway, but there are many, many other examples. These projects are largely intended to facilitate the transport of raw materials to port, especially along the Pacific coast. Pacific maritime routes are often favorable to those that go through the Gulf of Aden or other areas. Transport security, in other words. Second, there's a perceived change or a growing focus on the part of China in region-wide diplomatic initiatives in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've mentioned already the China CELAC Forum, which was established in 2014 and which excludes the US and Canada. China has also recently announced several new regional credit lines and investment funds. China's central bank announced this month that it will establish a $10 billion fund for investment in Latin American manufacturing or production capacity. And finally, we've seen some important changes in Chinese firm operations. Recent case study analysis suggests that Chinese companies have made real advances in community relations and adherence to local environmental and labor standards. But complaints about Chinese companies continue to surface, and the environmental standards of China's top lenders to Latin America are still weaker than those of other international financial institutions. There are also indications, troubling indications, that some Latin American governments have intentionally weakened standards and regulations in order to attract Chinese and other investment or to facilitate cross-Pacific trade. And China's ongoing financial support for certain governments in the region, to include Maduro's in Venezuela, is thought to enable continued economic mismanagement and to facilitate corruption and standards erosion. So I would conclude simply by saying that China is and will continue to be an important economic partner for many countries in the region, even as economic growth slows on both sides of the Pacific. Whether China-Latin America relations are in fact win-win and mutually beneficial, as China indicates, is debatable. Chinese economic engagement has certainly contributed to growth in some countries in the region, and Chinese investment could be helpful for some Latin American industries or sectors. But mutual benefit requires the region's governments to negotiate effectively and maintain necessary environmental, labor, and other standards, and I think that the U.S. has a real role in potentially facilitating these developments. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. It was excellent, and kind of great segue into the line of questioning. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes in the first round. So I spoke in my opening statement about John Kerry's words that the end of the Monroe Doctrine was upon us, and we've kind of seen a U.S. disengagement in the region. It just doesn't rest with this president. It actually transcends a number of presidents. And so do you believe, and I'm asking all witnesses, do you believe the U.S., the lack of U.S. leadership and engagement in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Secretary Kerry's comment there, the Monroe Doctrine is over, has impacted China's objectives and actions in Latin America? Dr. Ellis? Your mic on there?
A wonderful and very important question, Mr. Chairman. I have the opportunity to interact regularly with colleagues in China, and I remember at least 3 colleagues shortly after Secretary Kerry's speech before the OAS actually called me or emailed me saying, did he really mean it? Clearly, China looks for signals, and I think that was an important signal that at the very least, China should not decelerate its pursuit of economic and strategic objectives in the region. And certainly, while our Department of State has done some very credible and very good work in thinking on the topic, clearly, with some of the difficulties with respect to U.S. embassies and some of the lack of presidential level engagement on this topic, respectfully, I think Latin America has clearly perceived that lack. And in that vacuum, I think as well, when one takes a look at the relative lack of definitions for what the United States has to offer the region, that China's seemingly value neutral, take our money, will help you develop, fills that vacuum.
Yeah. Dr. Dussel-Peters?
Yes, I would agree very strongly with you that we perceive on the one hand this lack of a U.S. commitment and interest in Latin America in general, and particularly regarding this new triangular relationship. No? This is why I propose at the end of that the United States should actively participate in this institutions that already exist in Latin America, such as CELAC, among others, but that the U.S. should also try to create new institutions and to create new knowledge in academic, in public and private institutions in the United States. We have a lack of interest from the United States, a lack of active participation, and as I stated in the beginning, a very clear long-term strategy from the perspective of the Chinese public sector.
Okay. Ms. Joseph Harris, I'm going to ask a question to you a little bit differently. Let me first say that very impressive resume, and look forward to reading some of your works. And so let me ask you the same question, just kind of a different way. Do you think if the U.S. was engaged more in looking for trade opportunities and reaching out, spending more time focused on this hemisphere and working with our neighbors and friends here, do you think that would create less of a opportunity for China?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Firstly, what escapes us sometimes is that the U.S. does in fact have a fairly strong trade relationship with the Caribbean and Latin America. That is a historic relationship. However, the engagement appears to have weakened immediately after the events of 9/11. There was a dropping of the ball, as it were, as America, and rightly so, needed to redirect much of its interest to the Middle East. And that is the period in which China saw as a strategic opportunity. And there is where many of the inroads had been made diplomatically, economically, and culturally. However, we have a very strong history of interoperability between our respective militaries. That, and that is something that we should seize upon and consolidate. And one of the things that I had said in my original text is that without security and good governance, there could be no chance of economic sustainability. So that we need to revisit that strong history of interoperability, continue to probably fortify the CBSI initiatives, and then build from there in terms of exploring areas in which that have been fallen off in trade, like the CBSI, begin to explore those areas and see how we could improve. But I'm pretty hopeful that it can be done. We've got a recent change in political administration in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago recently. And those very countries who had been instrumental in the early 2000s in bringing together a robust security architecture. So we continue to look to the United States and our colleagues in the military and the security industries to invigorate those types of relationships. Thank you, Chairman.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Myers, do you think the lack of U.S. engagement opens a void, and do you think that China would not have this opportunity if the U.S. was more engaged?
Absolutely. I believe that U.S. disengagement in the region provides or has provided considerable space for China and other partners, economic partners, to engage quite a bit over the past few years. But I think this also has to do with what many Chinese scholars are calling diplomatic transformation. And this is not a well-defined concept, but I think the general idea is the development of a diplomacy or a diplomatic presence that is consistent now with China's global growing role. And the One Road, One Belt strategy is described in this form as our new initiatives over the past couple of years, like the China CELAC Forum in Latin America. So there's kind of an enhanced interest also in basically during the Xi Jinping administration in promoting a new form of diplomacy, more or less.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my time's just about up. I just want to ask Dr. Dussel-Peters, what do you think about the railroad between Peru and Brazil? You know, China's investing this kind of money, you know, that with lack of any sort of highways and other ways other than the Amazon to move goods and services and people around, the railroad could be a game changer. What are your thoughts about that?
Look, I would say in general, this proposal and this project goes hand in hand with what China has been proposing in the last 2 years under this heading also of the new Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road strategy, which means focusing development on infrastructure. No? So there are a group of fundings. We have added up more than $150 billion that China has been committing for infrastructure projects, and this project could be one of these. By the way, you have to be careful also that not all the partners of these projects have been informed of the project, no? Which means this project was launched in Brazil, and other countries such as Peru were also informed by the news, no? Usually you would think that you would work the other way around, which means you would work 2 years and then you inform about this publicly. No, right. It's not the only project that has been launched this way, and there are a group of big projects all over Latin America that can change the geostrategy and this new triangular relationship very profoundly, particularly the canal of Nicaragua, that is very close to the United States.
Thank you very much. My time's up. We were there in November last year, Congressman Yoho, Congressman Salmon, with Chairman Royce, and just knowing the geography and watching that, it's fascinating to me that they would do that. I look forward to talking more about that. I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Getting back to these projects, you know, you read about these projects, 100 billion, 50 billion. How realistic are some of these projects? I mean, this canal, how realistic is this? Or is this just propaganda from Ms. Myers? We'll start with you. shaking your head. You don't think it's too
I have strong beliefs about the canal. Well, since it was first discussed in 2013, there has been really no progress, either in terms of construction or in terms of finance, as far as we know. There is a considerable lack of transparency surrounding this entire project, so it's difficult to tell. The general consensus is that in order for this to proceed, it needs to be funded by a government, and specifically, in this case, China. But there's no clear evidence at this point that China is backing this project in particular. In fact, China has tried to distance itself from the Nicaragua Canal, unlike all of these other major infrastructure projects that it's proposed throughout the region, and these others are big too and extremely expensive. So I don't see much progress in the coming years. We've seen the construction of an access road, a gravel road, some lights. There are many, many promises of additional milestones, but they tend to never come to pass. So,
Dr. Russell Peters?
I agree that there has been little progress in this project in the last months, but I would take it very seriously, no? Very seriously in terms that A, it has not been disregarded by the Chinese public sector. B, the public sector and the central government in China have massive resources for this kind of projects, as in the case of Brazil, as in other projects in Mexico and others. And I can imagine that this might be a concrete bargaining coin for the future, for some kind of other negotiations. No? Thank you.
Dr. Ellis?
I think an important point which you raised by this is the fact that perhaps 80% of all of the projects that we commonly talk about do not ultimately happen, but those 20% and also the expectations raised by this are reshaping the region. I concur that Nicaragua Canal project is probably about 6 months behind schedule and is probably on the point of falling apart. We can mention other projects from investment in Pampa de Pongo, the mine in Peru, Rio Blanco, others, the failed Dragon Mart project in Mexico, the Mexico City Querétaro Railroad. The list goes on. And the fact is that not only do Chinese have difficulty in engaging with the region, but for that reason, many of the projects fall apart. However, the fact is that the projects that do go through, approximately $55 billion in investment to Venezuela, about $12 billion to Ecuador, reshapes and keeps alive those all the countries. The net effect on trade relationships is we're moving towards what experts call a reprimatization of the region, which actually makes them much more vulnerable, the region much more vulnerable, as we see declining commodity demand right now. We're seeing a shift in the institutional balance of the region. When we say, well, what keeps UNASUR alive, what keeps SALAC alive, and why are countries pulling away from the inter-American system, the OAS, one has to look at the impulse, the inspiration of being able to turn to Chinese markets, even if some of those key projects are indeed in doubt.
Thank you. Ms. Joseph Harris, I don't read about too many projects in the Caribbean from the Chinese. What are they doing in the Caribbean?
Well, thank you so much, because I did have a list of very, very specific projects in the region. And I'm glad I have the opportunity now to elaborate on it. Just bear with me. Okay, here we are. In terms of the specific projects,
Still working on it.
I think I had listed them here. Yeah. In relation to Jamaica, the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, Barbados, I had made some very, very specific pointers identifying where these projects were. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the Chinese have built a children's hospital. They have built a national arts performing center. In the case of Jamaica, they've made huge investments in the sphere of what you will call investment, critical infrastructure, hoteliering. In the area of the Bahamas, they've also gone into critical infrastructure, port, and hoteliering. In Grenada, they have invested considerably in what you will call cultural centers and so. In Guyana, they have also invested in the bauxite industry in terms of writing off at least 9 major loans. In Suriname, they've gone into mining, and it's a long list. And what I'm saying essentially is that some of these countries, we have to look at the strategic importance. Trinidad and Tobago is a provider of natural gas to the United States. Guyana, in the case of Guyana, you have gold. In the case of Suriname, you also have gold. In Jamaica, you have bauxite. And this is a materializing of the Chinese quest to go after resources, raw materials, in anticipation of the global looming shortage that is around the bend. In addition to which, there are ALBA members, members of the Bolivarian Alliance that are also CARICOM or Caribbean community members. And as China allies with many of these countries, it may be very inadvertently empowering the alliance, which is ideologically adverse to American and Western-styled neoliberalism and institutions. So one has to look at the Chinese asymmetric approaches, the way in which they model their diplomacy. They're treating with members of the Caribbean community who are members of the Bolivarian Alliance, empowering them, splitting allegiances, and thereby tilting the balance in terms of the US influence within the region. Another very interesting area is in what I would look at as the currency wars, asymmetric types of warfare. You may or may not be aware, Chairman, that recently, in July of this year, an agreement was signed with the Bahamian government and the Chinese to go into arrangements with trading the renminbi. And the possibilities are that other members of the Caribbean community may be able to access trade through that form of currency as distinct from trading with the US. So one has to look at the matrix of indirect relations, currency diplomacy, port diplomacy, and the very unique types of modeling that the Chinese are using that are by no means normal. And these are the areas in which the US influence is gradually being eroded. Thank you, Chair.
My time is up. Thank you very much.
I thank the ranking member. I'll now turn to Chairman Salmon for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to kind of follow along the same line of questioning as the chairman, Chairman Duncan, started with U.S. involvement, U.S. presence in the region. And I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Ellis, first. I believe that Chairman Duncan is frustrated. I know we've had conversations that while the U.S. presence in the region seems to be not as strong as it could be, there's been a vacuum. I think, Ms. Myers, you referenced that. And while China's influence seems to be growing in the region, my question is, if we could get a TPP agreement, would China's influence in the region grow? Would the United States' influence in the region grow, or would it diminish on either side?
Thank you very much, Chairman Salmon. I think you raise an excellent question, and I indeed in my own writings have been a strong advocate of the TPP, but certainly an effective and well-negotiated final TPP. What I see is for both our Asian partners and our Latin American partners, the question is this emerging importance of the Trans-Pacific. What is the rules that governs economic interactions? Will it be a Pacific in which the states which are larger and better able to coordinate their government and financial and commercial institutions can kick open the door, bring away intellectual property, impose their labor laws and workers on others, or is it a rule of law Pacific environment in which there is respect for labor laws, in which there's respect for intellectual property, in which all states have the opportunity to reap the fruit of their hard work and good policies, whether Japan or China or otherwise. I certainly am a strong advocate of a future TPP which remains open to China, but one in which we have a prosperous Pacific in which China and the other players play by the rules. And I believe that that creates a bigger pie for all parts of the Pacific community.
Well, in some parts of the Western Hemisphere, there still are some serious governance and rule of law concerns, issues.
Yes.
Some corruption issues, human rights abuses, lack of environmental consciousness, and organized violence in some parts of the Western Hemisphere. So is that political and economic climate in the region, is it going to hamper China's ability to be able to function effectively or navigate in the region, or are they pretty adept at navigating with these types of relationships? Could they serve as a model for greater government accountability and respect for the rule of law for these countries, or does China perpetuate these problems?
An excellent question. China is very careful not to impose its own concept of a model, but very happy to allow others to draw from China the lessons that they will. What concerns me is, in many ways, there is a new ideological struggle that I see of the 21st century, represented to some degree by the model of states such as the ALBA states, a very statist concept of how you negotiate with Asia, versus that which is represented by, for example, our partners, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but as well the Alliance of the Pacific. What concerns me in states like Nicaragua, in Ecuador, and in others to a certain extent, Bolivia, et cetera, is that the opportunity to have Chinese money allows populist leaders to do direct relationships, which gets them away from accountability and oversight that is previously imposed by institutions such as the Inter-American Development Bank, et cetera. And in many ways, the reason why China has loaned so much to Venezuela, over $55 billion, but has had very little success in the projects that they have pursued very hard in countries like Mexico and Colombia and elsewhere, is that those countries have established laws and institutions and strong bureaucracies and are less willing to bend to the Chinese rules, whereas countries such as Venezuela has been more willing to do state-to-state deals. And at the end of the day, that disadvantages not only Western businesses, but I believe disadvantages the rule of law in the region. It encourages corruption and bad governance, and really it prejudices the people of the region and their long-term democratic interests and development, I believe.
I'm going to paraphrase then. What I'm hearing you saying is that if the United States isn't deeply engaged through activities like TPP, if we're not leaders in the region, then there is a vacuum that's filled by others. Is that something others on the committee would agree with, or on the panel would agree with, that if we're not actively engaged in determining what the rules of the road are for engagement in the Western Hemisphere, if we're not the leader through things like TPP, then countries like China have greater authority to dictate those rules of the road? Is that looks like most of you agree with that? The other thing that the question I wanted to ask is that with some of the economic woes that are happening in China domestically, is that going to impact their ability to be able to interact in the region with some of the financial crisis that they've been going through? Do you think, Ms. Myers, that's going to impact their ability to be able to complete the agenda?
Certainly, we've already seen a pretty remarkable decrease in trade with Latin America, especially in South America, commodities trade over the past year in particular, but also before that. Also, turbulence in Chinese markets, in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and then the recent devaluation of the yuan has had effect on global markets, obviously, and then so also has affected Latin America quite considerably, and especially, again, commodities exporters, Chile, Peru, and others. And so in the short term, yes, there's a considerable effect on Latin America, and this is troubling to many. In the medium to long term, I think, well, in the medium term at least, we'll see considerably more demand still for Chinese goods, for Chinese commodities, for Latin American commodities in particular, and for Chinese goods in Latin America. These things aren't going to change immediately. Growth has slowed in trade, but it's still growing. And China very much is looking not only to Latin America, but to other regions for raw materials, of course, but also to help it facilitate its reform process. So many of these investments promote, for example, economic upgrading, which is a major element of reform, or the use of excess steel in China, and that's a major problem in the domestic Chinese economy. So we'll see more, absolutely.
Thank you, Chairman. We'll now go down to Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much. When we're discussing China and its influences, This is not just a situation where the United States wants to dominate the world, and we want to make sure that people are listening to rock and roll instead of Chinese instruments playing their style of music. Just note that in China there's been no political reform whatsoever, although we had promised that if we increased our economic ties to China, increased our investment, increased our involvement, that there would be a liberalization of their system, and there is no opposition party, opposition press. There are no people who are permitted to openly organize and criticize the government. China has also, at the same time that it's had no political reform, has become ever more aggressive in its many territorial claims which we have ignored for a long time, but now they seem to be reemerging. Plus, you have military action taken by China over dubious claims in the South China Sea. So as we're discussing the issue of China's influence, it's not just another country versus our country as our influence. It's whether or not this totalitarian power will be expanding its area of justice influence, but in some ways control. Let me ask, and let me also note this. Years ago, there was, I first noted this when, and the Chinese targets and how they handle it economically, when on the Panama Canal, as it exists today, a Chinese company was able to buy, this Hutchison Whampoa, was able to buy terminals on both sides of the canal, thus putting the Panama Canal in a position of being dominated by this Chinese-owned company. And how that company received that contract after the actual Panamanian government had been notified, an American company, that they had won the contract, and they were there to accept the contract. In the middle of the conversation, a phone call comes in, and I think it was the vice president had to leave the office, and when he came back, says, "Oh, there was a mistake made. The contract went to somebody else." And the question, what I'm leading into is, it was always my belief that somebody had been paid off. Is this the way the United States, we put our people in jail if they make bribes to foreign leaders. Is there any such rule of thumb for the way the Chinese companies deal with these third world countries that we're talking about and developing countries?
Well, certainly China does have rules. However, its understanding of how those rules restrain it and the degree to which it enforces those rules, especially with respect to companies overseas, is a gray area. Indeed, many fear that one of the sources of a reduction in Chinese foreign overseas investment may be that the crackdown on SOE heads in China itself may make China's leaders reluctant to pursue deals which would lead to their personal enrichment in places in Latin America. But certainly the deeper question that you raise is a very important one, and that is that to the extent that you do not have an analog of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, those type of deals increase corruption in the region at two levels.
When you come from a society that doesn't have a rule of law, doesn't have an independent judiciary, doesn't have stated rights in terms of people's relationship with legal procedures and who owns what property, et cetera, you would expect that in that country there would be some major problems in dealing with the citizens and companies from that country. Let me ask you this about those companies that are dealing with these nations that we're talking about. Many of the companies in China that are making profits, et cetera, are actually companies that are owned by the People's Liberation Army. Are any of the companies that you're talking about owned by the People's Liberation Army?
Probably one of the best examples that comes up, and of course, ownership is a difficult concept, but we talked about the Nicaragua Canal. And when we take a look at the mysterious Mr. Wang Jing, although he is basically a defense contractor in the Chinese parlance, the offices that he has in the region in Hong Kong, filled with patriotic paraphernalia. However, when one actually looks at his primary company, a telecommunications company called Xinhui, which is involved in building a system of systems type of infrastructure for the PLA. The way that he got to be a very young 40-something-year-old billionaire is because he made a leveraged buyout to this company, and then miraculously that company began getting billions of dollars of contracts from the PLA. And so certainly aside from Hutchison and your very good point about Hutchison's relation, and Hutchison, of course, was just recently bought by a mainland Chinese company. But I think one of the things that worries me about Wang Jing is the fact that those ties through Xinhui indicate that certainly there are certainly interests. If there are commercial interests, there are interests behind those interests, and I think that needs to be a concern as we look at the nature of the relationship in the future.
Anybody about the People's Liberation Army or something? Yeah.
I just wanted to add that Wang Jing's company, Xinhui, just declared bankruptcy, so it kind of bodes poorly, I think, for the canal operation as well, considering that he's funding much of the first sort of elements of that.
Look, in our experience, the public sector in China is omnipresent in qualitative terms. It is not sufficient to go very concretely regarding one public institution, but you have the central government, you have cities, you have municipalities, and a mixture of these governments. The public sector, to have an idea, more than 86% of Chinese FDI, according to the work we have been doing from 2000 to 2013, has been pursued 86% by the Chinese public sector. No? So there is an omnipresent public sector participating in FDI. And I would briefly relate to the question that was posed regarding TPP by the chairman and Mr. Salmon. No? I think TPP is not sufficient as a Latin American strategy. TPP is dividing Latin America. A group of Latin American countries are not geographically related to the Pacific. And I would highlight how important it would be to modernize, to rediscuss, for example, a topic such as NAFTA, which has been completely left aside. I would very strongly propose to upgrade, to modernize NAFTA.
In the essence of time, I'm going to need you to wrap up. We'll try to respect the other members' time. So I know Ms. Joseph Harris wants to respond. If you could do it briefly. This gentleman has somewhere else to go, and I wanted to try to get to him. So Ms. Joseph Harris, if you'll just respond briefly.
Thank you. I'll get to the crux of it. What we are looking at, Chairman, is that we are in an ideological war. The member is quite correct. It's ideological. And I would even go so far as to say that the whole idea, the whole notion of a China-U.S. dynamic is ideologically based, and I would cite what I mean by it. America's ideological apparatus, represented by its globally dispersed network of central banks, international monetary system, multilateral corporations, vis-a-vis a Chinese facade where you have no democracy, no rule of law, that brings us in what you call a juxtaposition. It's an ideological face-off. This is what we are looking at, and that whatever we are looking at ties back to ideas and ideology. And what makes the Caribbean in particular vulnerable is the fact that we lack that strong ideological base, save and except for the institutional formidability of the OAS, which is the only strong and true multilateral forum. And there is where we need to look at the institution within the Americas as a countervailing effect against China. Thank you, Chairman.
Great points. Mr. Yoho.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you all being here today. It's disheartening to see that we're losing our influence with our closest allies, our closest countries, and that China's kicking our rear end again. And it's because, and I wanted to ask you, and before I ask any questions, Dr. Dussel-Peters, I'm glad to hear you say that the TPP really wouldn't help the area. It would be us negotiating a strong trade agreement with all of Latin America, and you would agree with that?
Yes, very strong.
Okay. And then The other thing is, what I see is a stale relationship. It's like a relationship between people, the United States and Latin America. It's become stale. We need to revitalize that, and it's what I've heard from you, it's from a lack of engagement. And I know after 9/11, there was a cause for that, but we need to move on, and we need to reinvest in our closest allies before other people. And I think we need to restate the Monroe Doctrine. I think that's something that we need to stand for what the Western Hemisphere stands for. Because what we've seen over the course of the last 20 years is a slip or a slide into socialism. They're lining up with Iran. They're lining up with Venezuela or Russia and China, and we're losing that influence. And and what I wanted to ask you is that, why is that, and what has caused that? Is it because our country, meddles too much in telling other countries how to live, the kind of rule of law they should have, and our ideologies? And I know China doesn't do that as much. They kind of just go with the flow and invest in the infrastructures. What's your thoughts on that, Dr. Ellis? Are we meddling too much in telling people how to live?
I think that to some degree, the right kind of meddling is useful. One of the dilemmas that China finds itself in right now, for example, the change in government in Guyana, the new very effective government of Dr. David Granger, China suddenly finds that the dirty deals that it makes with one government, when it's replaced by another government, it now finds problems. It faces the same dilemma in Venezuela.
I'm glad they find that.
But I think also, with all respect, one of the things that I believe that we need more of, and it's ironic because it's a point that's made, I think, very effectively in the most recent Defense and Diplomacy review document that the State Department has put out, is value-based leadership. In my respective judgment, what we have not done sufficiently, is explain why the U.S. concept of rule of law and free markets in democracy will bring broad-based development, and why it is the best deal. Why going with the easy deal with the Chinese money does not bring sustainable development. Why going with particularistic negotiations between a leader and a Chinese company is not the best way to bring value added in the company involved. And I don't think that we do that effectively enough in explaining our case to the region.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because what I have seen in other countries, especially in Africa and some of the other countries, China puts money into there, but then they suck the resources off and they leave. And, you know, you're not getting a Chinese company. You're getting the Chinese government, their military, their secret service, and all that in one. It's not a Chinese company. I mean, it's a facade. We've seen that over and over again, and we know that for fact. And but I have to give them credit. They are making headway, and they go in there and they get the trace minerals, the rare earth mineral, and they're smart at doing that, and we need to tighten up our strategy and our foreign policy. Let me ask you, does the OAS, are they courting the Chinese? Are they shunning us, Ms. Joseph Harris?
Member Yo, I really, really welcome this part of the discussion. I would like to tag on to what
sure.
my colleague said. We
You've
do,
got a minute
in
and
fact,
18
have
seconds.
a very robust inter-American institutional system under the OAS and its very organs that are poised, positioned to do exactly that, sell the inter-American ideal to the community. And I think there is where we probably dropped the ball, and we need to focus there on rebuilding that past. Thank you.
Ms. Myers, do you have anything you want to add into that? Did I catch you off guard?
Not on the OAS, but I would say that, I mean, at the very least, there was a Pew Research study that was done a couple of years ago on perceptions of China and the U.S. in Latin America. And it was very clear that the perceptions of the U.S. are still extremely strong. China is rising in certain respects, but we have a very strong relationship with Latin America, and there's much to build on in that respect. But yes, in terms of finance, no conditions finance is very appealing to many countries in the region. And for that reason, not only in terms of investment, but also in finance, there have been cases when Chinese companies and banks have won out over American companies and banks, and that's problematic.
I appreciate everybody's answers. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman for staying around, and I know you've got other places to be. We'll go to Mr. Smith from New Jersey.
Chairman Duncan, thank you very much for the hearing, as well as for my good friend Matt Salmon, and of course, Abiel Sirius. This is a very important subject, and I thank you for bringing some light and scrutiny to it. A similar type of Chinese hegemony is actually occurring in Africa as well. I chair the Africa Committee. And I'm very concerned, you know, sometimes what is China's interest in Latin America? We also have to ask, what is Latin America's interest in China? increasingly for despotic regimes in places like Sudan. It is Bashir who greatly cherishes his relationship with Beijing. And of course, Evo Morales and so many others, the FMLN in El Salvador, increasingly. My first trip to Latin America was 3 times during the FMLN wars, and saw up front and close the terrible devastation. But who was providing those funds? It was all coming from the Soviet Union, usually by way of Cuba, and violence was being used for political means. Now China is stepping into that void with the demise of the Soviet Union, and they're doing it all over the world. The bad governance model, as you know, is being very aggressively promoted. I was in Bolivia twice in the last couple of years working on behalf of an American who was being held captive in Palomarsaro prison. Went to the prison. No charges were brought against him. 18 months in that hellhole. And Evo Morales and his government, and I, while there, became even more sensitized to it, just loved Tehran and just loved China because it is a source of legitimacy for money and trade. So my concerns are, we'll have Xi Jinping coming to the United States and visiting with President Obama in just a few weeks, very, very shortly. I'm doing a hearing before he comes on China's race to the bottom with North Korea on human rights abuses. They have gotten far worse. Name the issue: trafficking, name torture, the crackdown on religious belief. And then you see that they're having additional and enhanced influence in the Caribbean as well as in the rest of Central and South America. Very, very disturbing trend, because dictatorships, whether it be in Venezuela or elsewhere, thrive on that kind of cooperation with a dictatorship like China. So my first question, or big question, is, what is Latin America's interest? Why are these guerrilla movements now turned, whether it be FMLN or the FSLN in Nicaragua, finding such a friend in Beijing? 12 countries in Central and South America and the Caribbean still or support the Republic of China on Taiwan. Is there pressure being put on them to sever those ties or downgrade that recognition? And again, when it comes to providing arms, from AK-47s to everything else, when it comes to using the internet to surveil dissidents and people who espouse real democracy, what is China's influence there? Because they have literally written the book on how to find good people, dissidents and others, track them down and throw them into prison.
I would offer, and I think they're very good questions. China's interest, in my judgment, Latin America's interest ranges from the legitimate and the commercial to the less legitimate. I think it's reasonable for many Latin American businessmen and leaders to see opportunities in Chinese markets, to see opportunities in attracting Chinese investment, to see new possibilities for funding sources. Not all of those interests are illegitimate. However, it's a spectrum, because as we move into other types of things, the opportunity of a Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro to be able to escape good financial oversight and democratic institutions and things like that, because he can get the quick Chinese loan, or now the $10 billion in new Chinese loans in the run-up to the December 6th congressional elections in Venezuela. And it goes into the personal as well. One takes a look at one of the sons of Daniel Ortega, Loriana Ortega, who was instrumental in putting together the Nicaragua Canal deal as well as the telecom financing deal in Nicaragua with Xinhui. And the fact is that the Chinese deals, in part because of the lack of oversight, provide both personal enrichment opportunities as well as opportunities for leaders who don't want to have to adhere to the types of values that the United States is promoting: democracy, labor rights, free markets, transparency, to be able to get away with that. that, but only get away from that for a time, because ultimately it leads to a greater collapse because of the economic contradictions, because of the poor governance. But when that collapse comes, it prejudices us, because it is we in this hemisphere who are geographically, physically, economically, and by ties of family related to the hemisphere, whereas the consequences are much more indirect in terms of what happens when those deals go bad for China.
Thank the gentleman from New Jersey. We'll go to Mr. Shabbat from Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask probably just one question here, unless I have a follow-up, and I'll address it to the whole panel to the extent you'd like to answer it. My question is in regards to China's objectives with respect to Taiwan and Tibet. In your opinion, is China strengthening its diplomatic relations with countries in the Western Hemisphere, at least partly, in an effort to isolate Taiwan and to some degree Tibet, or a free Tibet someday? If yes, how successful have they been so far, and specifically, what are the benefits that China offers to Latin American countries in exchange for their support in this effort to isolate, especially Taiwan, but also to some degree Tibet? And whoever wants to take it first is welcome. Ms. Joseph Harris.
Member Chabot, yes. Thank you very much. In the case of the Caribbean, it has been a rather interesting scenario. Within the CARICOM community, which is a 15-member coalition, we have a situation where there's an absence of what is called an Asian policy. And the Chinese have been very, very successful in penetrating that absence of policy by literally purchasing over diplomatic relations in terms of inducing countries to split their allegiance and remove their relationship with Taiwan in favor of Beijing. And the inducements have been large sums of money, donations, and cash. Less than diplomatic, one would say, but they've been extremely successful in it, so that currently there, I would say, there are still 4 countries out of CARICOM left, and the Chinese are very aggressive in terms of getting them to withdraw that allegiance with Taiwan. So I would say that they've been very good at it thus far.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yes. Dr. Peters?
We have been working in the last years on the Central American countries in the relationship with China, and it has been very interesting how, as a result of the improvement in the relationship between Taiwan and China, China has been extremely pragmatic regarding the issue of this diplomatic relationship and recognition, which means that China has been able to accept delegations from countries without a diplomatic relationship. They have been doing turnkey investments, trade, and a big group of an interesting dialogue, political dialogue also. And I would tell you finally that in the region, China has also increasingly stated that while it offered a group of projects to Costa Rica who broke these relationships in the region, this will not happen again in the region. No? So again, this pragmatism, even in the diplomatic arena, is very important.
Thank you. Dr. Ellis?
Yes, as you know, in 2008, the then newly elected Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou formed an informal agreement with then Chinese President Hu Jintao to basically suspend this politics of the checkbook. What's happened in general is that they've honored that relationship, but I also look towards the importance of the future. In other words, in that time since 2008, just about every Central American and Caribbean president who has recognized Taiwan has expressed an interest in changing. We saw it with President Lugo, then President of Paraguay. We saw it with President Funes in El Salvador. We saw it with President Zelaya and later President Lobo in Honduras. We saw it with President Martinelli in Panama, et cetera, et cetera. The Chinese have said no, but the way I look at it is that they have prioritized the resolution of their dispute between brothers over any short-term gains that they could get from Central America in the Caribbean. In that sense, I think it's been a lesson for where their priorities actually lie. But what concerns me about that is that if that truce ever breaks down, it's very clear that China has been advancing its commercial engagement offices of CPIET, et cetera, so that if China decided to start accepting that interest in changing, very, very rapidly Taiwan would find itself without diplomatic recognition and in grave situation diplomatically in the region.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Myers, I got a little time left.
Sure, just very briefly. I mean, there is a possibility that Tsai Ing-wen, the new candidate who's part of the DPP party, could win the next election. And of course, you know, she and her party are more supportive of Taiwanese independence than the KMT. If that were the case, then we could see a sort of reemergence. There's been a diplomatic truce so far, but we could see a lot more competition between China and Taiwan in the region, especially in Central America and the Caribbean. I'm not sure how that would play out, but there's a good possibility there. And then just on the Dalai Lama, you see both sort of direct opposition to Dalai Lama visits, for example, and indirect. If, for example, you have a Confucius Institute at your university and you're receiving a lot of funding from China for that Confucius Institute, are you going to invite the Dalai Lama, even though you might want to? Maybe not, because it certainly risks complete, you know, removal of all of that funding. So you see certainly that sort of influence happening, very, very indirect, very sort of under the table, but it is happening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I thank the gentleman from Ohio. Great questions. Chair will now go to Mr. Sears from New Jersey for, I think, the final round of questions here.
I have two observations, and one of the observations that I have is that one of the reasons that our two regions are so tied together is the fact that this is a region where they have had many revolutions, and the only country that really has opened the doors to all those people over the years has been this country. So it has developed an umbilical cord type of relationship that I think for China is going to be very difficult to break. I don't know if you agree with that or not. And the other observation that I have is the OAS. I know Ms. Joseph Harris. I disagree with you. I think it's completely ineffective. I think it's an organization that doesn't speak up enough on the abuses in this region. And if you are there to represent these countries, you are just too influenced by some of these countries not to speak up on the abuses that are going on. I mean, I haven't seen the OAS talk about Venezuela and the abuses in Venezuela at all. So when you tell me that you have an institution that it could be a vehicle, I'm sorry, I really don't see it as a vehicle. That's not to mention the abuse in Cuba, but, you know.
I agree with you on the ineffectiveness of the OAS. I don't want to be misunderstood, but I'm saying that there is an institutional framework. It needs to be empowered. It needs to be made effective. I'm familiar with the framework because years ago I've been part of experts teams, but I'm agreeing with you that a lot needs to be done in order to empower the OAS so that it can be effective. Thank you.
I believe that, in fact, CELAC has been very successful in this dialogue with China, and I believe it would be very relevant for the United States to participate in CELAC. For whatever reason, OAS has not been active in this area. No?
Mr. Sizer, I think you raise a very, very important question. Thank you for the opportunity. To me, I agree with you that the OAS has deep, deep difficulties. When I look at this from a strategic perspective, though, I ask myself, is it in the interest of the United States to try to empower a debilitated institution or to let it die or be ineffective? And when I look at the alternatives, it worries me. For example, China chose to engage with CELAC, which excludes the United States. Other states in the region, one could say Brazil, have interests in the empowerment of UNASUR to fight the region's interests as opposed to the OAS. But if the OAS remains ineffective, we, in my judgment, do not have an effective vehicle. China was an observer member of the OAS since 2004, but they chose to work through CELAC. Our Colombian friends came asking for help from the OAS to resolve. To me, if we allow the OAS to be ineffective, and that goes down to leadership on our part, then we prejudice ourselves respectively, strategically in the hemisphere. That's my respectful opinion.
And Ms. Myers, what do you think?
we're hosting a meeting with the OAS today, and they've done a fantastic job of helping us out. But no, I mean, I would actually agree with Enrique that U.S. participation in some form in CELAC, I mean, it was the brainchild of Hugo Chavez, and so it almost intentionally did not include the U.S. and Canada. But I think at least in initial observer capacity, or by facilitating in some form some of the technical cooperation that's been proposed, could be a good thing. The OAS, obviously, there's much to do there to improve its function, but I agree that it also is a useful organization to the extent that it can be more effective in the region.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you very much.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank the witnesses. I thought this was excellent discussion. I don't know that we solved any problems, but I don't know if that was the goal. The goal was... I don't know that I'm going to have another subcommittee hearing with you either. But I learned a lot, and I think this dialogue about U.S. engagement and opportunities to allow others to get a foothold in our hemisphere is so critical. And so I want to thank you, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue. I look forward to reading some of your material as well. So pursuant to Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 business days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. Being no further business for the committee, we'll stand adjourned. Thanks so much.
Thank you.